All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Sorry I can't be here today, but due to unforeseen circumstances, I have to give this webinar. So follow along. There are two parts to this webinar. This is part one, and the next one, of course, is labeled part two. And there are videos that posted onto YouTube, which are only accessible to our class. So moving forward, before we get there, I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Now I need to unpack that a bit because here in the PDSB, we went ahead and used this policy based on human rights and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Ontario Human Rights Code to allow us to have this acknowledgement, pretty much saying that we are the colonists and newcomers of the land and acknowledging the fact that the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation were here and we are on their land and their territory, sharing it thusly. So before I tell you the crux of this in terms of the chapter that we read, here are the agenda that I laid out in terms of health education and in terms of whenever I spoke about policy specifically from the Canadian scope all the way down to the policies we have here in the school board and school district. This is the agenda that I would use when I would talk with the trustees, director, superintendents, principals, parent councils, parents themselves, my colleagues as coordinators, teachers, TAs, social workers, psychiatrists and psychologists that are at the school, and so on and so on. All the different stakeholders that put together the altruistic goal of education, which is for the betterment of kids and the betterment of education towards a more equitable outcome and reality within our schools and in our buildings. All right, so having said that, this is an example of how I disseminated policy reflecting on the laws for the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Ontario Human Rights Code, unpacking the health ed, basically the sex ed portion of this document, and also, I don't want to say rebuttal, but more specifically to give information to parents and everybody out there, stakeholders, all alike that I mentioned earlier, why this health ed curriculum or the sex ed curriculum is important, where it comes from, and how our policies are enveloped within this as teachers across our district and across our province. And I have shared this PowerPoint presentation with the Ontario Association for the Support of Physical and Health Educators and, of course, the Ontario Ministry of Education over the last 18 months. And remember, as I go through this, to keep four main tendrils in your mind. So they are centralized versus decentralization, professional authority versus lay authority, the tensions between uniformity and diversity, and the language and religion have historically had a tension between both. All right. So in a moment or so, I will go through the presentation as I would if you were parents, superintendents, social workers, what have you. All right. So throughout this, you might want to jot down or keep in mind any of the issues that arise from this, and who exactly are the actors within this issue of sex ed. Okay, so on the HPE site for our board and on the Ministry of Education, it lists all this information here where the ministry went ahead and started to hear what the parents were saying about the actual document. At the end of the day, it's about securing identity of the kids and making sure that their identities are secured in our actual programs across the building, not just health ed, but everywhere through an equitable lens. To what end? Well, you see them all there. It is important for our kids to feel safe in our schools throughout Ontario, specifically in this context within the health education curriculum, which reflects the policies of equity and, of course, as we know, the Ontario College of Teachers Act. All right. So we do have critical health and physical literacy that we have in our document, which basically boils down to the two slides that you will see here. Physical literacy, knowing about yourself as a moving body, and health literacy, knowing about yourself as a sociological moving body in terms of relationships and how you are and how you age and mature, right? Remember, this is contextual to grades K to 12, all right? So moving forward, we have foundations for a healthy school. It is very important to have a positive and supportive social environment for our students, K to 12, and this includes obviously, acceptance and inclusion of all peoples when it comes to their human rights. And it boils down to the emotional safety of these kids and making sure that they feel safe in our classrooms. And that by developing a positive sense of self, which is crucial to their learning needs in Ontario schools. So this curriculum is divided up into several segments, which is the personal skills expectations, to understand themselves better. To interpersonal is how we associate with each other moving forward as we are humans and social beings. And again, this is reflected by the OHRC. All right, so the three main strands are as follows. Active living, which you can read there, is all about getting up and moving. Movement competence and understanding why and how we were moving through the TGFU model for teaching games for understanding. And of course, this is the most contentious part, which is healthy living, looking at all those aspects of their well-being as students, right? So highlighted there are the most pertinent and most questioned aspects of this curriculum. So moving forward, we're going to talk more about sexual orientation and gender identity, specifically because those are the two main topics that parents and families had issues with. And if you do a media sweep or look at social media, and even last week when we had that conversation, many people brought up the sex ed curriculum, and those are the two tendrils of that curriculum that most parents have questions or issues with. All right? So in healthy living, we need to make sure that we have an equitable, anti-discriminatory, and inclusive environment, but at the same time, balancing that with religious beliefs and cultural factors. Now, saying that, we can have religious beliefs that are embedded in culture, but we can have culture that is not embedded into religious beliefs. All right, so keep that in mind moving forward when it comes to healthy living and when it comes to actual sexual orientation and gender identity. All right, so here we have the link to Bill 13, which is the addendum to the Education Act that came out and it was approved by the government in 2012, which basically, you can read there, that everybody in the spectrum of LGBTIQ, which is the acronym used by the Ministry of Education. However, as you can see the listing is a lot more comprehensive. This basically tells us, through the eyes of the ministry, reflected by the OHRC, that we as teachers need to be an equitable educator and actually bring up and talk about the LGBTIQ, or as I refer to as queer culture. So that way kids who identify and or know kids who identify, like parents and so forth, family members, that they go ahead and they're allowed, and educators are allowed to talk about this within our lessons from kindergarten through to grade 12. All right. Moving forward, I'm going to tell you specifically what grades in the health ed or the sex ed document, and we're going to unpack certain key words. But before we do that, we have to look at what queer is defined as. And you see it there. That's my definition that I've had published in that following article underneath the queer and sex ed logo there. It's basically a reaffirmation or a reclamation of the word queer, because in the 50s it meant something odd, out of the usual, and out of the ordinary. But now this culture, the queer culture, is regaining this word as their depiction of power in terms of a heteronormative world, okay? So why talk about this specifically? Last week, many people mentioned that the sex ed part was a controversial area in the education system in the last year or so, and you're right. And like I said, this is the PowerPoint or the information I would share with many, many stakeholders across the district. So we have reading, writing, and sex ed. So within this, I'm going to now show you how policies have formed this, have shaped the empowerment of this topic, and even what power and policies are in, so that way parents can actually take a look at the curriculum, question, and then we can have that conversation as to who is covered by the OHRC and what parts can parents actually ask for exemption, accommodation, or modification of the curriculum. All right, so here we have a Venn diagram basically between sex and sexuality. And the reason why I have this here to show you is pretty much people read the document and think it's all about sex ed. And then so most people that I've talked to and parents who've had concerns and even trustees who question the difference between sex and sexuality really needed to sit back and understand what sex is and what sexuality is, because there's certain parts in the curriculum that the parents can ask for accommodation or even exemption, and other parts that the OHRC, the CCRF, and all of our policies for inclusive and equitable education, where parents and families are not allowed to ask for exemption, and as teachers, we cannot give it to them. All right, so here is the difference here in very, very simple terms. So sex is about the biology of the male and female human mammal body. And if you see here, it's all about cellular process and so forth. This is explicitly taught in health courses, and ironically enough, in some topics are taught in other courses too, like family studies, Science, grade 9 science. When I taught grade 9 science, there was a unit for evolution, so it was called sexual and asexual reproduction. So we talked about the biological reproduction means of single-celled and multi-celled organisms. That, ironically, did not get me any complaints or any worries from parents. However, when I taught health ed, and when most health ed educators teach this part of the curriculum, this is the part where parents tend to not enjoy the curriculum and ask that the kids get exempted from it, or accommodated expectations, or modify the actual material being said. And the parents have every right to ask for how and for the materials the teachers are going to use to actually teach these topics, which opens up the door for speaking to parents about this topic. I mean, sexuality education, however, is all about gender identity, and it's all listed there. Now, I want to point out to where it says human rights. There has listed both the laws and the policies, and the program policy memorandum, which I'll unpack later on in part 2, that pretty much allows us to teach these health courses, and that all courses in an equity-based curricula, we can deliver this message. So gender identity, sexual orientation, right, based on human rights laws and policies we have in our districts. So when you want to talk about gender identity and it's a topic that's brought in your classroom, or you want to talk or bring a book forward like Entangle Make 3 and talk about different kind of families, let's say you're a primary teacher, that is okay. You can do that anytime between September all the way to June, because people within sexuality education, so gender identity and sexual orientation, are protected by the Ontario Human Rights Code. All right. So what it says here is that a parent, what I've said before, is a parent can ask for an exemption or an accommodation from the curriculum when it comes to sex ed. So the biology of sex, maturation, and all the different aspects when it comes to us as biological mammals and beings. And parents can ask to see the resources that we have to teach this, and ask for either an accommodation so kids won't learn about it too much, and specifically in grade 1, the body parts. Some parents are afraid of the pictures we'll be showing and or any of the resources that we have. So it is very wise of us who teach health to be able to have that communication with parents, so that way it alleviates any kind of fears that they might have. All right. So communication is key. However, they cannot ask for sexuality accommodations and exemptions, because sexuality, gender identity, and sexual orientation are all covered under the Ontario Human Rights Code, and that is reflecting in our district policies for equity and inclusive education. So moving forward, the next few slides, this is the type of materials that we use. Obviously, it's age appropriate. So a grade 3 teacher won't talk about this as the same as a grade 9 teacher would, right? And here we have our gender identity and gender expression guidelines. It's in draft form here. So especially since this week when Trudeau government is tabling laws to protect those people who identify as transgender, so that with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 15 will specifically add transgendered people into the protection of human rights. That is a huge step forward when it comes to us for human rights. Now, this Venn diagram looks confusing, but if you look at the bigger picture, there's bullying and harassment. And you can see where types of bullying and harassment actually lie within the sexual, homophobic, gender nonconformity aspects. So what to do, I'm offering you some information here. This is the information I would offer to parent councils and so forth to make sure that all of our kids have that emotional well-being and that safety in the classroom, and they can continue to learn.